With more on those supply chain issues and specifically how they impact the distribution of drugs and pharmaceutical supplies, we turn our attention to Jay Timmons. He is the president and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers here in Washington, D.C. He is also the chairman of the board of the Manufacturing Institute. Mr. Timmons, thank you for being with us. I want to begin with COVID-19 as we now approach almost 3 years since this pandemic first came to the international attention. But when it comes to supply chain issues in general, what did we learn about the supply chain and the weak links that we've seen over the last couple of years?
Well, I think we learned exactly that, Steve, that we did have some weak links that needed to be repaired. And manufacturers, because manufacturers are all about solutions and solving problems, I think have shown great progress in repairing those weak links over the past few years. It is hard to believe it's been 3 years since the pandemic started. And I think the other thing that is frankly remarkable, and I don't care who you talked to 3 years ago at the beginning of, or the onset of the shutdown and the pandemic, nobody would have ever predicted how resilient, incredibly resilient manufacturing would be during that time, really shattering expectations across the United States. And so I think what we see here is a really unique opportunity to not only preserve the gains that we've made over the past few years, but also to really strengthen the sector more than we probably thought possible pre-pandemic.
But let's talk about some of the challenges that you and the 12 million men and women that you represent every single day. We're seeing higher energy prices, inflation is on the rise, and a real challenge in the workforce. So how has that complicated the plan to kind of move out of this pandemic and to a more normal system of distributing supplies in general and drugs in particular?
I'm going to make a small edit to that question because it's almost 13 million people now who are working in the sector. And in fact, that's the most in manufacturing since November of 2008. But to your point, we do have labor shortages in the sector, just like every other sector of the economy. But we have 800,000 open jobs on average every month over the past, I guess, year and a half in the sector. And so that does put pressure on manufacturers. If demand continues to remain strong, which we see it remaining fairly strong, you just don't have enough people to make the goods to respond to the demand. So when your supply's tight, what does that do? That leads to higher inflation. Higher inflation, obviously, or also the other problem that is created is it does create shortages in the supply chain. So all of those things kind of feed onto each other. But I do believe we're coming through that. We're coming through it fairly remarkably, especially in the last few months. We've seen reports that show perhaps the pace of inflation is slowing and the supply chains are starting to unfreeze, and that's all good news for us. But one of the things that we have to do is we have to make sure that we protect some of the policies that allowed us to stay resilient through this very difficult period that we've just experienced. And I would say that the number one thing that manufacturers believe we need to protect and perhaps even strengthen are the tax reforms that we were able to get into place in 2017. Those have helped us invest and hire and grow wages and benefits here in this country.
So let me go back to your earlier point about some of the good news, and this may play into what you just mentioned a moment ago about incentives, tax incentives and others. But generally speaking, how do you either reinvent or reimagine America's supply chain in this post-COVID environment?
Well, look, I run the National Association of Manufacturers in the United States. If I had my druthers, everything in the world would be manufactured in the United States. But look, that's not practical. It's not realistic. So I think the question becomes, what do we need to do as a nation? What do our policies need to reflect in terms of trying to prioritize and incentivize manufacturing investment and job creation here? we've done a couple of really good things. In a bipartisan way, we passed the infrastructure bill last year. This year, we passed the CHIPS and Science Act. Those were two huge steps forward because they did incentivize parts of the manufacturing economy or made it easier for to handle the logistical needs of manufacturers. Now we need to look at some other areas of policy and policymakers, the newly elected Congress is going to have to tackle some issues related, for instance, to trade. They're going to have to make sure that we're not overreaching on the regulatory side of things. And those are, I think, key objectives for policymakers, whether they're in Congress or the administration moving forward. Don't harm the good progress that we've made. Allow us to invest here in the United States and hire more American workers, and hopefully incentivize and train workers moving forward so that we are able to attract more folks into the sector.
And I realize this next question is pretty basic with a lot of complex issues around it, but why don't we make more in this country? What more can we do? What should we do?
I actually think we make a lot in this country. I think that is a bit of a misperception. There are things, obviously, just think of face masks for one, that we didn't make here in the United States during the pandemic or pre-pandemic. And we discovered that we need to, we need to make sure that we're supplying our healthcare needs here in this country. That was something that really wasn't a priority for us in the past. And I think it's going to be moving forward. But if you think about all the things that are made that you use every single day, so much of that is either made here or made with component parts that are made here, or the finished product is made here. So we still have the largest manufacturing economy in the world, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. But we have to make sure, I'm going to go back, and I know it sounds a little repetitious, we have to make sure that we don't harm ourselves moving forward. I use an example when it comes to pharmaceuticals, for instance. The TRIPS waiver that is being implemented or negotiated and implemented at the World Health Organization, that's going to give away our intellectual property. And if we give away our intellectual property, while, by the way, at the same time, not renewing our research and development tax credit, that is going to erode our ability to create that next great innovation that will either make the world a better place to live or, in some cases, like a pandemic, save the world. So we've got to make sure that we're taking care of business here, and that includes protecting intellectual property. It means making sure that our tax rates are the most competitive in the world, and that our regulatory system is performing in a way that enables us to solve the world's problems without penalizing manufacturers that are doing exactly that.
But clearly, as you mentioned, the CHIPS Act is designed to bring many of those manufacturers back to the U.S., not from Taiwan or India or other countries. And we're seeing new plants, for example, in Ohio and in New York State. Where else will this lead it? And can we apply that to the pharmaceutical industry? Lessons learned from chips to drug manufacturers.
Well, I tell you, one of the reasons that we had to move down kind of that path on chips is because we allowed our nation's, frankly, superiority on semiconductor fabrication to leave this country. And the reason we did that was because of poor tax policies and regulatory policies that made it difficult to make those important products that literally go into everything that we manufacture today, or that we have in our homes, or that we use in our offices or in our daily lives. We allowed that to go elsewhere. Part of that, also think about this, in order to make the semiconductor chip, you also need critical minerals. We've made it difficult to mine those minerals here in this country. That is also part of the CHIPS legislation, allowing us to actually produce those or to access those minerals that are so important to the production of semiconductor chips. So I think that the lesson learned here is don't do things that harm parts of our economy or harm parts of the manufacturing economy and then have to do double duty to bring it back. Another example, I mentioned the research and development tax credit. We've let that expire. Hopefully, we will see it come back later this year with tax extenders that will be debated in the lame duck session of Congress. But look at China. China provides a 200% tax deduction for research and development. So we've provided for the last several years a 100% deduction. We've already been lapped by China, and now we're letting this annual deduction expire. It makes no sense. So first, I would say do no harm. Don't allow things that are actually allowing us to succeed expire or change. Let's make sure that we protect those, and then let's look at some other opportunities to grow the sector.
So let me bring it back to the issue of drugs and pharmaceutical supplies and the simple concept of supply and demand. How do we make sure in this country that we have the supply that meets the demand?
Well, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record here, Steve. I'm sorry. But I want to go back to the importance of incentivizing manufacturing investment here in this country. Those tax cuts in 2017 became, unfortunately, a political football. And there were some that wanted to make infrastructure investment and the CHIPS and Science Act a political football as well. Thankfully, we staved that off. I was really sorry that in 2017, the tax cuts became a purely partisan issue, because so many folks on both sides of the aisle would talk to me about the importance of investing here in this country. And they understood that our tax rates were some of the least competitive in the entire world at that time. So I think our challenge is to not allow ourselves to politicize our competitiveness or our ability to compete with other economies and other governments around the world. So that's number one. Let's make sure that we have the policies in place that allow our pharmaceutical companies to invest here in this country and to hire and to raise wages and benefits. Then secondly, let's make sure that we don't do anything to harm what I think is the gold standard for us in this country in terms of intellectual property protections. So again, the TRIPS waiver of IP protections for vaccines, including diagnostics and therapeutic products. We should not be giving away our intellectual property. I mean, we're fighting China tooth and nail to try to protect our intellectual property. I don't know why we would allow an expanded waiver when it would jeopardize innovations that are needed to fight not only COVID-19 and future pandemics, but also harm kind of current and future agreements that are aimed at boosting global production and voluntary technology sharing that we have in place right now.
Jay Timmons is the chairman of the board of the Manufacturing Institute, also the president and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers here in Washington, D.C., an important voice in this conversation, especially with regard to the supply chain issues. Mr. Timmons, thank you for being with us.
Great to be here. Thank you, Steve.